The problem of climate change. First of all, we know climate change exists. We can tell this by the increasing temperature on the planet. The average surface temperature on Earth has increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. And we know this climate change seems to be getting more extreme. Every year since 1977 has been warmer than the average temperature during the entire 20th century. 16 of the 17 warmest years in recorded history have occurred since 2001, and 2016 was the warmest year ever recorded. Finally, we know humans are linked to climate change. Scientists can identify human fingerprints that are associated with climate change, and they can figure out what proportion of climate change is associated with human activity. Today, they agree that climate change is being primarily driven by carbon that is put into the atmosphere by human activities, like driving cars and using factories, etc.
Now that we know that there's a problem with global warming, let's take a more in-depth look at some of those effects. For example, the glacier melting and rising seas kind of go hand in hand. Florida International University have calculated that every inch of sea level that rise is a result of 8 feet of beach loss and shorelines due to erosion. Also, salt water from the seas, when they're introduced to freshwater aquifers, is threatening the source of drinking water and make raising crops very problematic. For example, in the Nile Delta, where many of Egypt's crops are cultivated and grown, widespread erosion and seawater and saltwater intrusion would be disasters into their country because they have very little land that is left for farming and very little source of water that be used for irrigation. The International Government Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, projected in 2001 in its report that sea level will rise anywhere between 4 and 35 inches by the end of the century. The high end of this projection, nearly 3 feet, would be unimaginable and unmitigated disasters like we have never seen before. So this is something we really need to consider and take into effect because it will have widespread implications from all over the globe. Weather is also something that will be majorly affected with climate change. Heat waves, for example, are periods of abnormal hot weather lasting for days to weeks. In 2011 and 2012, there were a number of intense heat waves, being almost triple the long-term average. The recent heat waves and drought in Texas in 2011 and the Midwest in 2012 set the records for the highest month average temperatures. Along with those heat waves can cause droughts. Droughts are high temperatures lead to increased rates of evaporation, including more loss in the moisture through plant leaves, even in areas where rainfall does not decrease. This increase in surface evaporation and loss of water from plants can lead to more rapid drying of the soil. In the same year, in 2011, when many locations in Texas and Oklahoma experienced more than 100 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This alone contributed to more than 10 billion in direct loss to agriculture alone. You can also experience floods. Floods are major weather factors with heavy or prolonged rain, snow melt, thunderstorms, and storm surges from hurricanes. All right, and human factors can also contribute to more floods. The building of dams and levees, the changing of the drainage system over land, such as pavement and building up suburbias and neighborhoods throughout an area can definitely increase the chance of flooding. Hurricanes also plays a major role, or we see a major effect in changing hurricanes. They have increased in their frequency in the Atlantic since the early 1980s. This measure of intensity, frequency, and duration of these number of storms have become stronger and stronger to Cat 4 and Cat 5 category storms. And this have also been linked partly to the higher temperature of the seas in their region. In addition to that, we have also seen that other weather patterns have been affected. Your winter storms have increased in frequency and intensity since the 1950s, and they have shifted more northward over the U.S. These have included the intensity and frequency of thunderstorms, tornadoes, hail, and damaging winds. So we can have a major effect here in the U.S. or across the globe as climate change continue to take effect. Climate change is not only a human thing that only affects human beings that live on the planet. All other animals will also be experiencing this change and this shift. A lot of times when we talk about the Arctic, we mostly mention the glaciers melting or the polar bears, the loss of polar life. But I put this picture here to show how interlinked the system in the food chain was in the Arctic. And as the sea changes and glaciers melt and rise in temperatures, things that at the base of the food chain, once they go, it will have a domino effect on the bigger animals that we get to see. So we may not see all the mussels and the snails and the cods that live at the bottom of the sea or on the sea floor, but those things feed and are the basis for the polar bears and the penguins and the fox and the seals. So I really want this picture to show how interlinked everything is. So once we see the polar bears decrease or we lose the polar bear, that means we have lost plenty, millions and millions and millions of other life form also that interlink and feed and what's the basis to give the polar bear its system to feed off of and live. So this was a great picture and I really thought it really showed how everything interlinked together. And this one was thanks to the Aspen Institute. They did a really good job with this picture. This here is a picture showing that how everything is interlinked with our climate and our environment. A lot of time when we talk about climate change and how to best address it, a lot of focus goes to the economy. It almost seems as we think we live in the economy and work in the environment. So this here shows that no, we live in the environment and we are greatly affected by things in the climate, in our environment, but we work in the economy. So those two things should not be inseparable, but should go hand in hand. So we see here at the top, we have climate drivers, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with increased temperature in many locations. And once that happened, that changed the rain pattern and the weather pattern and the cloudiness and the humidity. And we see that in the environment, once that happened, the environment, airborne allergens are changed and how we interact that with the urban landscape and the emissions. And then that caused us also to change our social behaviors and how we interact. So social determining our health, it's compromise our baseline status. And that'll really affect mostly the poor people if they do not have access to air filtration and quality housing and how close you stay to traffic and interstates and the pollution that's put off by just commuters going out day to day. And how do you go out and exercise? Is the air even good enough to be out to breathe? Um, and so this exposed that once you have poor outdoor air quality, you spend a lot of time inside. It's due to the pollen count and the increased allergens and, like I say, how close you stay to those pollutants. And once you are there and it's in the environment, it's around you, we're surrounded by air, those pollutants really affect our health from the most vulnerable to the unborn, the premature deaths. Hospital ERs goes up. We have more respiration symptoms and breathing problems, allergies and sensitive to disease, lung cancers, COPD, cardiac vessel disease, loss of school and work day just from being ill. Now that's when your climate environment really gonna start to affect your economy because you do not have a vibrant workforce to go out and be productive. So this right here shows that the climate and what we live and what we breathe and those pollutants have a big effect on our quality of life and how we go about and interact every day with the environment, with the parks, and with the people in our social life and how it affects our home and how it affects our health and us as a species here on Earth. So we really need to pay attention to the climate and make sure that we're protecting the environment and climate as much as we try to protect the economy.
In response to the problem of climate change, this office, the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, helped to oversee the drafting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC has 197 parties. All of these parties have agreed to its stated objective, which is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. This convention sets limits on greenhouse gas emissions that come from individual countries. However, the limits are non-binding, and there's no enforcement mechanism to ensure that state parties comply with the limits set by the UNFCCC. Because the UNFCCC is non-binding, 192 parties came together to ratify the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. The protocol is binding in nature and has two branches to provide enforcement of the convention. One is a facilitative branch and one is an enforcement branch. The facilitative branch aims to provide advice and assistance to parties to promote compliance with the convention and the Kyoto Protocol. This branch will provide advice and facilitation to state parties in implementing the protocol, and it promotes compliance by parties with their commitments. Also, the facilitative branch may provide early warning to states of potential non-compliance with emission targets. The enforcement branch determines consequences for parties not meeting their commitment. Each type of non-compliance requires a specific course of action. And questions of implementation should be resolved within 35 weeks. In cases of non-compliance, the enforcement branch will make a public declaration that the party is in non-compliance and will also make public the consequences to be applied.
So, we know what the problem is, and we know how we've gotten to the point we're at today. So now we have to ask, what do we do about it? The answer is that we have so many options. We often hear about the big options: drive less, be more efficient, and plant trees. But we fail to consider the snowball method. I'll explain. A snowball can't be constructed from snow in one specific spot. Rather, it must be gathered from a wider area to ensure it has enough mass to stay together and get the job done. And once you get a snowball together and start it rolling downhill, it grows and grows simply because it pulls more and more snow from other areas. We propose this as the right way to impact climate change in a realistic and effective way. Stephen Pacala and Robert Socolow from Princeton University have proposed what they call stabilization wedges, or reducing emissions from a variety of sources, rather than relying on an enormous change in a single area. For the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, two key areas that we consider in our quest to end poverty are people and planet. When it comes to people, our first priority is to reduce and eventually end poverty. But how can this be accomplished, all while saving the planet? First, we propose the development of what we are calling green armies. Now we know plants and trees absorb CO2, so why not develop groups with the sole purpose of planting trees? Additionally, food security and production do not always run hand in hand with environmentally friendly practices. In order to fix this problem, we propose the joint development of industrial-scaled greenhouses with sustainable and efficient practices like those currently in use at Cornell University. By building these types of greenhouses in developing areas of the world, possibly under the auspices of net-even or break-even cost factors, we provide employment as well as food security to areas that currently rely on scarce water resources, deal with drastic weather, partly as a result of climate change in some cases, and subsistence farming that prevents expansion of economic capabilities. These are just two examples of areas where people can benefit while the planet also does. In addition to the two people wedges, there has to be focus on the planet as well. One area that certainly represents the preponderance of CO2 emission is burning fossil fuels. But not all the news is bad on this front. China, our partner here at this roundtable, has been vastly improving their renewable energy usage with a focus on solar. Last year alone, China installed nearly 50% of global solar systems. This not only reduces their reliance on fossil fuels, but provides a geographically diverse increase in jobs because these systems are installed all around the country instead of relying on only a few areas to produce the fuel. The UNOSD proposes, in line with our previous suggestions, a partnership between the fuel producers of the world, including the representatives from ExxonMobil, and countries like China to build efficient, renewably based energy supply infrastructures for emerging countries and populations. This will allow us to get ahead of the inevitable reliance on fossil fuels and allow for the growing populations to avoid the pitfalls faced by members of this very council up to this point. We have all of the technology and capital needed to make this work, and the economic impacts of this partnership will ensure that the process is sustainable beyond just test markets. We have to take the lead in this and be willing to make the initial investments.
Ultimately, the path forward for improving climate change is by creating a new culture. First, that involves a culture of awareness. Based on a study from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, using data from the Gallup World Poll that was conducted in 119 different countries, over 90% of the developed world is aware of climate change today. That's a drastic improvement from the past and demonstrates the significant efforts that have gone towards educating the public. However, in the developing world, a lot of work needs to take place. Approximately 40% of adults in the developing world have never heard of climate change and therefore cannot be agents in improving it in the future. Education levels are currently the strongest predictor of awareness on the issue. Therefore, we need to invest in improving education, climate literacy, and public understanding in order to improve the discussion surrounding climate change. It has to be a joint effort between the developed and the developing world in order to ensure that the public is aware and able to contribute. The second part of creating a new culture is surrounding innovation. Overall, once awareness occurs, next, innovation needs to occur. This is important because with new technologies and new things in society, we're able to have a significant role and initiative in fixing the issue of climate change. First, increased awareness can bring global investment to use new technologies to combat climate change. We see this across many different sectors. For example, within agriculture, approximately $4.6 billion in new developments have been invested. Ag tech investments reached a 95% increase from previous years, and agriculture has a significant impact on the climate. In the past, it's only accounted for 13% of total global greenhouse emissions, but for countries that rely heavily on that for exports, such as Argentina, Australia, and India, agriculture can account for more than 1/3 of their total greenhouse gas emissions. In other countries, such as Rwanda or Bangladesh, agriculture accounts for more than half the total emissions. Therefore, it's essential that we look into all aspects in order to reduce overall emissions. Another area of interest is energy, in which current technologies are improving efficiency worldwide. That's through energy storage technology, investment in renewable power, or various other technologies. Another industry in which we can improve is construction. Currently, there have been significant improvements from the past, as energy-efficient buildings could represent a potential $1.1 trillion of global savings by 2030. Today, LEED certifications in the U.S. have increased from 296 in 2006 to 36,300 in 2016. Poland alone saw a 60% increase in green buildings in 2015. Therefore, through using new technologies such as automated building management systems that can detect patterns of lighting, heat, or air to conserve energy, or other various forms of conservation in construction areas, we can all improve and use innovation to solve climate change. Ultimately, creating a new culture must end in collaboration. First, there's awareness, becoming aware of the issue. Next, we use innovation to develop technologies and new strategies for climate change. Finally, we use collaboration to work together, bringing together all governments, technologies, and people across industries, sectors, and different disciplines in order to address the issue. It's a global issue and one that must be solved collectively. Therefore, collaboration is the key.